welcome to Real Voices of Happy Valley. This is our 60th episode.
60?
Yes, and they just keep coming until the real interesting voices dry up, which I suspect they won't.
Ever.
Yeah, but this is John Billingsley, who's an author, an expert, a researcher of folklore. Is absolutely fascinating. And the books he's written: West Yorkshire Folktales, Folktales from Calderdale, Further Folktales from Calderdale, A Mixenden Treasure, A Stony Gaze, Celtic and Other Stone Heads.
Which is to be found all around the valley.
Yeah, and it's really interesting. And we chatted to him in his house just below Old Town.
We started off by asking him about Ted Hughes, because he organises Ted Hughes Heritage Walks.
So take it away.
When I moved up here, I moved to Mytholmroyd, and I didn't know it then, but the house I got was just 50 yards from Ted Hughes's birthplace. Oh. And I set up walking up the hillside towards the moor. And the experience of that was really quite impressive. As you went further up, the air changed, the birdsong changed, the sound of the valley slipped away, and a different sound came up. It was it was like you're walking through different layers, onion layers of reality, and I felt quite smug about that impression. You know? And then I read an essay that Hughes wrote and published earlier. And he'd had exactly the same experience. He wrote about walking up that path to the moors, and it was just the same. And that's when I realised that the place has this impact on the human mind and psyche. And you don't have to be a great poet to pick it up. We can all pick it up. So we're living in this kind of miasma of different psychic impressions. And in that way, that's how I sort of see psychogeography. The landscape is affecting us, and we impose our ideas, interact with the landscape. And then when I got into folklore, I realised we've always been doing it.
Yes.
We've always been telling stories which try to make sense of it.
So is that how you got into folklore?
Yeah, probably all down to that one walk up the hillside, which I did time and time again. Then you get up onto the moors, and then all kinds of strangeness are released. You know,
that's right. I mean, it's beautiful, but it's more than beautiful. It's more than a visual experience, isn't it? Having walking up and down the hills and over the moors.
The famous Hughes quote was, "Moorland is a stage for the performance of heaven." And there are times when you're up on the tops and you don't feel very far from heaven, or at least some other cosmic sort of layer in a sense. It's just a kind of, it's the idea of being on an edgeland, right at the periphery of human settlement. And that's quite important.
Yes, absolutely. I've got a friend, Alex, Alex Wright, and she said she has an island experience when she goes up on the moors. She just imagines that the tops is all there is, and lots of islands, and you can sort of imagine that the valley bottom isn't there, or it's a different world.
I do find that up on Midgley Moor here, and it's a physical thing as well, because when you look at Midgley Moor, you notice it's on a little plateau lifted above the rest of the moor altogether, and that's where you start finding most of the Bronze Age monuments up there, the mounds and the standing stones. They're up there on this little island on a plateau. So sounds like she's got that right. There's a psychogeography working.
But you notice, I mean, you've obviously noticed the landscape. But a lot of what you write about is what people have done with it in terms of, the obvious one is the sort of the heads on the sides of buildings and things. How far back does that go? Or is it always been there?
Not as far as we'd like to think, as lots of people would like to think. You mentioned stone heads. Yeah, that's a kind of... well, back in the late 70s, I was on the original manual labouring team that put the Calderdale Way together.
Oh, right.
And so we were wandering all around the borough, looking at footpaths and repairing them. And on several of those homes, there were these carved heads and other decorations. And I can notice those because they're not pretty. You look at them, you think, oh,
it's sort of gargoyle-like.
Yeah, that's right. You wouldn't think anybody would reckon that's a nice thing to have on the house, but they paid for it and they put it there. So I'd ask people about them, and they'd say, "Well, I don't know. Obviously it's a 17th century house. It was there when we got it." But they say they keep evil away, and that got my interest up. And at the time, they were all being called Celtic heads. But I started realising that the 17th century wasn't a Celtic period, really, And most of these heads, and we found well over 100 in the borough, weren't by any means Celtic. Possibly none of them were. Some of them might go back to the 13th century.
Yeah.
But other than that, it's 17th and 19th century, which is why I started calling them archaic stoneheads and getting into the folklore around them. And that's when you also realise that most of the folklore that we hear today are 18th century, maybe. Not that many generations back. But because we're human and our sensory apparatus goes back generations and generations, it could be that certain germs within the psyche recur. Does that make sense?
Oh,
if you look at the stone heads, for instance, yes, they were being made around here, 17th, 19th century, but they also were in the medieval period. And we do know that the Celts did do them. They may not be a continuous link, but it feels like there's a wave going through history. Every now and again people think, I'll start making one of these ugly heads and it will be considered a threshold guardian. And I kind of quite like that idea that the human consciousness goes in waves and things surface at times of stress, usually. What I love about it is that it tells you how people thought about their world. I'm not that interested in stories of mills and people clopping to work in their clogs and stuff like that. We've done that so many times.
Quite probably neither were they at the time.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and as I say, we've done that kind of local history. It's easy, but what about the people? What did they actually think? What were the kind of fears? What were the stories they told each other? How did they go courting in a strict Christian surroundings? They're the kind of things which I think are the interesting bits of
And as a woman,
community.
I'm interested in how women were viewed in folklore.
Absolutely.
That if they knew how to heal with herbs, then that must mean they were witches. And
well, some people said that, but they wouldn't necessarily have said that at the time. Nobody wanted to be a witch, but I mean, there was somebody in 1646 in Heptonstall, Mary Midgley, who was suspected of witchcraft, and she admitted she could witch a little, but Elizabeth Crossley was a real witch, which tells us two things, really. Yes, people suspected women of witchcraft, but the women themselves weren't very nice to each other.
right,
There wasn't a sisterhood, and apparently more accusations of witchcraft in the 17th century came from women than from men.
right.
And
that's
more,
interesting.
it's going. This is in this latest book that I mentioned, the history of Calderdale witchcraft, and doing the research for that, it was, what, really? It's just
Tell us more.
No, we should get the book and read it.
Well, when it eventually comes out, because it's taken over 3 years to do, and one key reason for that is when you're looking at the history of that time, you realise with how awful conditions were for women, particularly those whose menfolk had died and they had no other way of finding an income, really, apart from doing the kind of things which you learn in the normal process of being a mother or housekeeper and so on. And you learn also about how people treated each other, and it wasn't very nice. You know, the kind of English country life image of the old traditional home, nothing like that. And I had to put those books and those research materials down because it was just too much to read. I was kind of like, oh God, I can't take this.
A fixed idea, don't you? Whether you accept it or not, I think we all do. And I had, this idea of women being oppressed by men who were scared of them, because they could do stuff.
I wouldn't agree with that
herbs
second part.
Right.
They were oppressed by men, certainly, but they were oppressed by the whole system.
Yeah.
Men were oppressed by the system, but obviously women got the worst of it. But it's not so much because men were scared of them, I think. It's just that the Bible told them, that women weren't fully humans, in a sense. That's probably overstating it, but it's a scripturally asserted and underlined position.
So it's
that they found
disappointing
themselves
that
in.
you get women saying, well, I'm fully human, she's not up the road.
Well,
go and see her.
The other thing that was a surprise in that was that when cases went to court, it wasn't immediate. People would think, oh yeah, you call her a witch, right, she's a witch, hang her. Something like 64% of court appearances resulted in acquittals.
Right.
So,
well, that's positive at least.
Yeah, it was a real surprise because we always get fed the popular idea.
Well,
For instance, that witches were burnt. No, they weren't. Not in England. They were burnt in Scotland, but they weren't burnt in England. And it's
So what? How? If a woman was found guilty of being a witch and they weren't going to set fire to her, what did they do?
If a woman was found guilty of being witch, nothing too severe would happen unless it could be proven that she'd murdered somebody or killed a cow. And if she had committed a capital offence and they reckoned it was because of witchcraft, then she'd be hanged.
Right.
And it's always, as I always
so, which
hanging.
would be, which is what she'd get if she hadn't been a witch, but had done that anyway.
Right. Yeah. So, then it's just a question of who did what and who calls who what and so on. But,
But you were interested in the difference between folklore and history.
Yeah.
It sounds like you're doing the research you're doing is history.
Yeah.
The folklore is different.
It is, I think, different. Yeah, because folklore tells you about the lives. History can be a bit objective, and it can forget things that are, to me, crucial. I remember reading in Colin Spencer's History of Hebden Bridge. He discusses a big fire at Thornburs, the chicken factory, the battery chicken factory. And he talks about how much it cost, how much damage was done. And while I was reading it, I'm reading this and thinking, yes, but how about mentioning the chickens? Yeah. And it was at that point, I think, that I started shifting away from local history because I found it many cases too objective, that it needed a kind of something to catch the dust that falls between the floorboards, if you like.
Yes,
so
So it's like the storytelling traditions, whereas
Well, some people-
the stories themselves might not be true, but all those things happened.
They might not be
and
true.
people believe them to be true, and that sort of makes them true enough to act upon.
That's a good point, Dave. A legend is defined as a story which is told as if true. And that's what happens if you go up to Churn Milk Joan, then whoever you're with might tell you a story. And some of those people will tell you that story as if it really happened.
Yeah.
Probably they know that it didn't. There was never a milkmaid who was killed by foxes there, which is what Ted Hughes heard. There was never a milkmaid who slipped and fell in the snow and spilt her milk. But there might have been a milkmaid who was a victim of a sex crime up there, whose story has become a little easier to tell a child who goes to Churn Milk Joan. All these things happen, but whatever happens, Churn Milk Joan is still the memorial to an event. The truth might not be complete, but the sense of truth.
That's what I was thinking. Really, it's true enough, perhaps.
It makes something of the landscape of a place. It characterises place. And
the difference between folklore and a lot of history is it is the normal people or peasants or working class people whose stories are celebrated rather than that of kings and queens and governments.
But they needed a middle person. In other words, when they had the story, there needed to be somebody literate who'd listen to them and think, better write that down as a peasant story. So, which is one of the greatest, most constructive uses of ministers and vicars. Because a lot of vicars in the 19th century, ministers, were interested in what their parishioners said, and they were interested in folklore, and they wrote it down. Well, indebted to them for that, because otherwise we'd not hear.
Well, that makes sense now, because when you look at probably medieval history, it's often written by a monk who's away in a monastery somewhere, who's heard various stories and written the history of Northumberland or the history of the world or whatever it happens to be.
Have you ever heard of the Green Children of Woolpit in Suffolk?
No.
Two children who were green emerged in a field. This is something like 13th century. And, the villagers took them, they looked after them. These kids, as I say, they were green. And they said they'd gone into a cave back where they lived, and they walking until they heard the sound of bells, and then they followed them. They came out in this completely different world. That's what the children said. But many years afterwards, because they couldn't speak the language at first, completely strange mystery. And we wouldn't know about it now if it hadn't been for a bunch of monks in East Anglia going around and even travelling to hear the stories of going around to different people and say, well, what do you know of this business? And then trying to make sense of it. But it means, from the other side, that most of our peasant or working class history, we rely on bourgeois sources. And then, of course, the bourgeois sources, some of them will put their own gloss on it.
Yeah.
It's
really interesting. And I was just reminded of a song that I have brothers and sisters in Canada, which is a long story. But we were there a couple of years ago, weren't we? And I taught my sister's grandchildren this song, because they like repetitive things. They're all like 5 and 6, that kind of age. And it was the one that ends, one is one and all alone and evermore shall be so.
Yeah.
And there's a verse that says, 2, 2, the lily white boys, clothed all in greeno. And then one is one. And it goes through to 12. And, and it's the origins of it are a bit unclear. It seems biblical, you're talking about the apostles and various things. But somebody said the lily white boys clothed in green is from an old folklore story.
It's ringing a bell of
About
something like...
two boys who end up in green. Appearing somewhere. So it just made me wonder if it was that.
And the green children were a boy and a girl.
Right,
the boy
okay.
died quite quickly. He never adapted. Do you know that they would only eat, they only wanted broad beans.
Oh.
And they wouldn't eat anything else. And that's why the
bizarre,
boy
isn't it?
died.
Yeah.
And then the girl kind of adjusted. And as they adjusted and started eating something else from broad beans, she returned to a kind of human colour. So that's a lesson for us all. Don't go mad on broad beans.
Lots of fairy tales.
Well, a lot of people say, were these kids fairies? But we don't know.
Like Hansel and Gretel and all the rest of them, they got these dark kind of...
Oh, yeah. Folklore is really dark.
Yeah. But what about your own history?
I've been here since 1975 in the valley, apart from 10 years I spent living in Japan. And before that, born in Twickenham, grew up in Acton.
So what brought you to the north?
Expelled from school at 17 for political activity.
Oh, wow.
Which is, they say school days are the best days of your life. That was the best day of my life. And then sort of knocked around for a few years before I came up here. Up here I've just done different things, like the Calderdale Way work and working at the library, Hebden Bridge. I've been editing a magazine called Northern Earth for 33 years until last month when I stepped down, passed it on to someone else. I'm working at Hebden Bridge Library for 33 years. So
you're still working there now then?
No, that was ended last month as well.
Oh, only last month, but so it's very recent then.
Yeah, I'm a full retiree now. Yeah. Can't believe it. No,
Join
I'm
the
not quite
club.
full. I'm not retired from voluntary stuff or writing or the Folklore Centre in Todmorden, which I'm very involved in. So yeah.
Yeah.
So what do you do at the Folklore Centre?
Officially, I'm a director. But I mess around with the library trying to get it into some sort of shape, and also help wherever the boss, Holly, the founder, she set it up, and basically moral support for her and do whatever I can. We've got a lot of great volunteers, and effectively I'm just one of those with a posh name, posh title. Volunteer.
So the library presumably is a folklore library in there.
Yeah, it's the only one in Northern England, really.
Is it?
It's the only folklore centre in Northern England. And so if there are any rich people listening to this podcast, we're really needing funding to keep it going. It's because it's not quite unique, because there's another folklore centre in Hampshire and another one opening in East Anglia. There's not many of them. So it's kind of quite important.
Absolutely, and I mean, I'm not surprised that if there's going to be only one in the north of England, it's going to be in this valley.
It's not surprising at all.
'Cause, I mean, and you've done some research in this. It strikes me that there feels more folklore, folk tales, not necessarily total 100% belief in the truth of them, but there's like acceptance that they are important more in this area than in most.
This is one of the things that really surprised me from when I moved in 1975 up until I moved to Japan in 1981. I was picking up stories from people I bumped into and talked to, mostly locals, of course. Then 10 years in Japan, I came back and I realised I wasn't hearing these stories so much, and by the late 1990s I wasn't hearing them at all. But the other big change was that in 1979, say, if I went to Hepdenstall or anywhere like that, I'd hear Yorkshire accents. And at the end of the 90s, you don't hear many Yorkshire accents around here. Hebden Bridge isn't a Yorkshire town except geographically, in a sense. You know, it's Hepdenstall. I watched from going from one caricature of short blokes in flat hats with whippets to tall, beefy fellas with golden retrievers in their fur-collared jackets and things over those 10 years. Yeah, and so in the 90s I realised, OK, we've got to get these stories done, written, and then with any luck people are going to read the book and then they'll start telling the stories again. And that has been happening as well. So because the great thing about all the stories that we have is that for people in the past, I'm probably talking 19th century or something, it formed like a cognitive map. They know their world because they can go to this place and tell you a story. You know, didn't happen in my time, didn't happen in your time, it happened in somebody's time, and this is it. And even if it didn't happen there, it doesn't matter because they're telling the story now. You know, do you see what I mean?
It's the story the story's real.
Yeah, and the telling
people.
of it. Yeah, and that all helps to kind of integrate the whole valley together. Because if you stand at Hepdenstall and you look out, what you can see is you're at the centre of a circle of hills, and that circle of hills is a world to all the people. That's where they got their spouses from. Where they got their job. They shifted around. They didn't go outside it very much. They just went in there. So you learn about older people's world by through folklore, through the things they did. And,
yes, I mean, I imagine we were all young in the 1960s when this whole concept of the global village came about. And then move on 30 or 40 years, the internet makes it, expands that so much more.
And then we think, I wonder if that was a good idea. You know, but it's the sense of a bounded world, which I think is quite important in folklore, but it also means if you've got a bounded world, you also get the rivalries, just as we have them now. You get the Todmorden calling Hebden Bridges names, and for instance, Hepdenstall people attacking Hebden Bridges that came up to the village at time. Another side of folklore is this appalling casual violence.
Don't know if you heard any of Mark Steele's radio programme. When he goes to, and he does that every time. He picks on the next town just to say, I don't know whether I should be going to Todmorden, and there's a huge cheer in the Trades Club in Hebden Bridge. He does it everywhere.
He does. It's perfect folklore, really, what he picks up on. Because we do that, and we have names for local towns.
And it's kind of being fed by the whole at the moment, in the road, where. Because we live on the other side of it in Todd, and the bloke in Aldi said, customs right down because the people from Hebden Bridge aren't coming to do their shopping, because it's always been a joke that Hebden Bridge won't have an Aldi or a Lidl, but it's where they shop. So all these stories are still being told, albeit in a modern, updated way.
The sense of rivalry. Yeah, that's always there. Which is kind of important as well, because building up a rivalry gives you this sense of self-identity.
Before we finish, I'm just interested in the folklore specifically. Is there anything specific to the valley that sort of makes it different from other places?
It's the scenery. I mean, I realise that Calder Valley does have an extraordinary survival of folklore. It's one of the richest areas that I know of in England. And so you start asking, as you did, why? Why would this be? And it's going to be the landscape thing that I alluded to before. You get up to Hepdenstall and you can you can look around at a circle of hills, and the whole valley is pretty much bounded within itself. So you've always got these little villages. All of them had their own little economic viability. We had mills in Old Town, we had mills in Midgley, and so on. So they can all stand on their own 2 feet, pretty much, within that. That we weren't all going to Halifax or Hebden Bridge or anything. And this sense of independence in it, you went out, you met people, you told your stories. All of this and the settlements lasted a long time, right the way from the earliest mills, which came with the Transpennine route along the Long Causeway, right the way from those times until the middle of the 20th century. You had these settlements that were surviving, surnames which you can trace back, like all the Greenwoods to Hepton Store and so on.
And Sutcliffes.
Yeah, that's right.
Robert Shaw, yeah.
So you've got stability, and you've also got a landscape which is characterised by dramatic places. By accident, we have got perfect conditions for folklore, people to pass on folklore, all kinds of it, of folklore, from beliefs to practices to the ways we say hello, even to dialect, which survived for a long time here. Doesn't anymore.
Oh, that's been really good.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you.
Yes, that was, that was really interesting.
I grab it on a bit, sorry.
No,
That's okay. That's